pretty good.
I think the idea of the platform economy as having these three aspects, the good, the bad, and the ugly, we're at a point in time where this is really coming forth because the platform economy has unlocked a lot of value. So there's been a lot of good. It's created a lot of efficiencies in the way markets work. But as platforms have grown, they've also amassed a lot of power, which has led them to make decisions which are not always in the best interests of the ecosystem. And that's where the bad comes in. And I believe that going forward, platforms will become a key source of competitive advantage, not just for companies, but also for other political and state level bodies. And it's at that point that we really need to be careful about how we think about their impact to society.
Yes, so positive effects of platforms are the good. Ones that we've really seen is the consumer welfare effect. So consumers via digital platforms, they get a lot of services and often now for free. And what has been shown also by research is that the value that people attain to it is much, much higher than the value that they actually have to pay for it. Or that actually the platform itself makes by, for example, showing these people advertisements. So consumer welfare is a very big one. It often doesn't show up in macroeconomics, right?
Looking at the information economy in general and within that the platform economy, GDP in itself is not an all-encompassing measure because there are many other forms of welfare that are created when new market interactions get unlocked. And when we are looking at the platform economy, we have to measure these externalities. We have to measure the larger effects that are coming out because of platform transactions to really account for the value that is being created by a platform. So when we talk about platform externalities, and in particular in the case of platforms, we refer to them as network effects. What exactly happens is that the platform provisions an infrastructure for producers and consumers of value to use. And the platform benefits because as more producers create value, the total value on the platform increases, so more consumers get attracted. As more consumers come on the platform, producers want to come there because they have a market to serve. So there's this mutual attraction and this feedback loop that keeps building power around the platform, more value, and that leads to very often to a winner-take-all effect for platforms. Platforms have amassed a lot of power, and the reason we need to be concerned about the kind of power that platforms have is because platforms are not just creating a product and selling it to the market. So it's not just the price and the ability to price gouge that platforms control, but platforms control market interactions and they control the behavior of the market. And because of that, we need to be careful about the kind of power these platforms are gathering because they have the ability to now start manipulating the markets that interact through the platform.
So when we talk with clients is that often the real power of platforms is not really understood, as in that it sounds like just a smart service or a nice app. But actually when they really get market power, that they are much more like a private market regulator. And indeed, as you say, they start to determine how commerce works, how communication works, how our news is getting distributed. So that starts to reach the very essence of, okay, how do we work and live with each other?
I think today a lot of platform regulation is very binary. The state decides you can either operate or you cannot operate. What is needed, I believe, is that regulators try to understand both the design decisions that go into making a platform and how platforms work, and also the data that explains how the platform is actually operating and the kind of welfare or the negative effects that are coming through because of the platform. And towards this, I would advocate that we need more of open data regulation where platforms share their data with regulators and there's a form of co-regulation that happens between these two parties.
Yeah, very clear. And that's also what we recognized in the research is that there's a lot of actions that platforms take in order to make both the market more efficient and to extend their own power at the same time, like gathering more data on users, etc. So we've also found that it's quite hard to get the right regulations in place without destroying the value that they create at the same time, right?
Yeah. I think we need a balance because we kind of have these three different families of thought. The U.S. Family of thought is that the market will regulate itself, and in China, on the other extreme, there is a state-owned approach to governing platforms, and in Europe, there's a focus on the individual. I think we need a balance between believing the market will regulate itself and also creating the right regulatory framework for companies that are owned by a single entity but managing these markets in the form of platforms for these companies to be regulated. So we need a combination of that self-governance that the market will bring with the right regulatory framework.
So what became very apparent at the Dutch Transformation Forum today in all the discussions is that regulation about data ownership, use, sharing became very important topics, and everyone understood that the way to encapsulate the power of the platforms is by looking at how they use data. And I think there were a lot of takeaways that this was really important to attack, but on the other side there was also a large unclarity within the audience on how to do this still and how to move forward, because there's a lot of intricacies that are very important to tackle when it comes to regulation about data. So that was, I think, a very clear takeaway.
We need to think about it from the perspective of competition. We need to think about how do we create competition for platforms, and one of the ways to create that competition is to ensure that the control points that platforms have are well understood by regulators, because platforms own unique aspects because of which they control the users on the platform. And if regulators understand this and ask this to be opened out, then there's an opportunity for more competition to be created. And I believe that's very central to having a more fair and equitable platform economy. Today, the platform economy is very imbalanced when it comes to the geopolitics of it. There's two centers of power, the US and China. What's more important is that is the type of platforms that we are talking about. In particular, platforms that regulate communication and platforms that regulate commerce. These platforms are either in the US or in China. And as these platforms start going global, this is something that we need to really think through in terms of the implications for other countries. We have Alibaba, for example, from China now creating the EWTP, the Electronic World Trade Platform, for which it is signing MOUs with African countries. So there's a very significant geopolitical angle when countries start partnering with companies. We also have countries themselves trying to follow a platform strategy and attract data from other countries and create a position of strength using their position in AI. As we move forward, Europe needs to very carefully think about the role that it plays in this platform economy. Is it just going to regulate platforms that come in from outside? Is it going to create internal competition towards these platforms? Because what we are going to increasingly see is that platforms, as they go global, they are going to create incentives and value propositions for users in different markets to come on board. And it is at that point that Europe needs to think about the role that it will play in the platform economy, whether it will just be regulation or the ability to create new platforms. The positive and the negative side of it. The negative side of it is that there are certain spaces.
In healthcare, we see that European players like Philips, like Siemens, are actually the ones who are building the leading platforms in healthcare. And the evidence of what we've been researching is that Europe can still take a place, but then not at the classical domains of where the other platforms have grown very big.
I would add to that a lot of industries that remain to be conquered, financial services, for example, is where Europe is taking a lead with the PSD2. And this is the time when banks need to think beyond just compliance to thinking about how to play in the platform economy. Similarly, there's an opportunity for Europe to think about how healthcare can be standardized and how an open data standard can be created around patient data. And similarly, given Europe's position in supply chains, logistics and supply chain automation could be an important opportunity for creating platforms. And finally, if we look at, say, the Nordics, they have an advantage in creating energy platforms. If you look at Germany, they potentially have an advantage in creating manufacturing platforms. So we need to think about what are the traditional strengths that countries have which can be leveraged in this direction, because you don't necessarily have to have a platform coming out of a startup garage only. You can think about your country's strengths and figure out how you can build and leverage that towards creating a platform strategy. Platforms are born out of digitization. When you digitize something, an important market variable, a platform opportunity gets created. And when you look at the Internet of Things, the Internet of Things is helping us digitize machine behavior. It's helping us digitize machine performance. When machine behavior and performance can be digitized, and when all of this data from different machines can be brought together, we can start mapping out entire industrial systems. We can start mapping out supply chains where different machines are interacting with each other. And it is around this data that new platforms can be created, which allow supply chain coordination, allow industrial production, and especially when we move towards more industrial segments, the Internet of Things will become an important driver for building platforms. Closer home to the consumer side, when we think about mobility, when we think about the smart home, today we are at a point where we have connected devices. We don't have platforms that are orchestrating these devices. And so going forward, a lot of our life is also going to be mediated by platforms which benefit from data coming out of objects that are connected to them.
And I think that's a very important point that you're making, that we're also moving much more from those marketplace matchmaker platforms to platforms who are orchestrating between all kinds of different actors. And we've also seen that already some very big industrial companies like Schneider Electric and ABB from Europe are already working on developing their own IoT platforms in order to make all their equipment smart and have the data all into the cloud to build new services on top of that. So we already see this happening.
Yep.
When we talk about, for example, digital strategies with clients, that they often say, well, new business models like platform business models, this is something nice to have for in 5 years. And what we see is that it's moving much faster than this. So you need to think about it much earlier. And also that the realization that setting up a platform is not that hard, but growing it and making it successful, that is really the harder part. It should not be underestimated and often requires a lot of patience, a lot of investments on the long term. We get a lot of questions on data monetization now from clients. And I have this hypothesis that platforms are one of the best ways to monetize data, but not directly, but by using data to build services on top of that.
Yeah.
How do you look at that?
Platforms monetize data by monetizing the value that accrues from that data. This can be monetized either in the form of creating analytics that other parties can access. It could be in the form of APIs that other applications can call, or it could be in the form of services that end users consume. Eventually, all of these are some form of a wrapper on top of the data to make it usable. And the reason it's most relevant and most beneficial in the case of platforms is because if you think of a platform, fundamentally, it is a set of services that attract data and a set of services that are built off that data to serve value to some other parties. And because of that, a platform is the best way of monetizing data. What's important is that very often when companies think about monetizing data, they are thinking about monetizing a database that they have. What platforms do is they monetize these actual services that are bringing on real-time data flows. That is where the power is, not in static databases. As a CEO today, you need to think about two things. You need to think about whether there's an opportunity for you to orchestrate a larger ecosystem by opening out your business model. Can you create the mechanism by which other partners, other players can work with your business and create value that you can capture? The first part is this: how can you use openness to encourage others to organize around you? The second thing that you need to think about is what role will you play in the platform economy, because building a platform is not the only role. Think about what are the specific platforms you want to partner with. Think about what are the unique capabilities that other platforms will need, which you can provide, and through that establish control on other platforms' ecosystems. So these are the things you need to think through to determine what your future positions for your business model will be. Yeah, and I think as a CEO, you also need to realize that you're already investing heavily in digitization. There is no CEO of a significant company today who does not believe that digitization is important. So as you think about digital transformation, you can transform your channels, you can transform your customer touch points, you can transform your backend, but unless everything works together in a new business model, you don't unlock the value of digital. To make that happen, that is where the platform comes in.
One of the very important things about platforms is often obviously skill. the more you have scale, also the better your proposition is getting. And we've seen that it's very hard to make a platform very large. So whenever incumbent companies are thinking about starting their own platform, we also often see that it would probably make sense to see whether they can make alliances, for example, with competitors or near competitors, to join hands and say we're going to build something together, a platform, before some outside disruptor is going to do it.